What if a single flight could change an entire industry? It began as an ordinary winter night in the sky, passengers settling into their seats, flight attendants moving through the aisles. But for 70-year-old Evelyn Carter, the journey from Atlanta to New York would become a test of dignity, patience, and quiet strength. Denied her own medical device in a moment of distress, spoken to like she didn't belong, witnessed by dozens, and yet almost no one spoke up. But here's what they didn't know: Evelyn's son, Daniel Carter, wasn't just another passenger. He was one of the most powerful executives in the airline's command chain. And when he made one call, the system itself began to shift. What really happened in the minutes after that call? How did a grandmother's quiet composure ignite a nationwide movement for dignity in the skies? And what does it take for an ordinary person to stand up in an extraordinary moment? Stay with us, because this is more than just a story about a flight. It's about power, respect, and the courage to change what's broken. Before we begin, remember to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss a story that matters. The late afternoon sun poured through the massive windows of Terminal 7 at JFK, casting long golden streaks across the polished floor. Evelyn Carter moved at her own measured pace, her small carry-on rolling quietly behind her. At 70 years old, she carried herself with a quiet dignity. Her silver hair was pulled back into a neat bun, her warm brown skin lined with the stories of a life lived with resilience. Today's trip was not one of leisure. She was flying to San Francisco to attend her younger sister's funeral. The thought had weighed heavily on her all week. And as she approached the gate for Aurora Skyways Flight 221, she silently prayed for a smooth journey. Boarding had been uneventful at first. A young gate agent scanned her boarding pass, offered a polite nod, and wished her a pleasant flight. She stepped onto the jet bridge, feeling the familiar hum of the engines growing louder. The first-class cabin smelled faintly of coffee and leather seats. Evelyn found her seat 2A by the window. She eased herself down carefully, her cardigan brushing against the armrest. She placed her carry-on overhead and, out of habit, checked that her inhaler was in the outer pocket of her purse. The recycled air in airplanes sometimes made her breathing tight. Just knowing her inhaler was nearby gave her comfort. Across the aisle, passengers chatted quietly. A businesswoman scrolled through her phone. A man in a navy suit sipped water. Somewhere behind her, a child laughed at something in a cartoon. For a moment, Evelyn let herself believe the flight might pass without incident. Then came the sound of measured, clicking heels on the carpeted aisle. Rachel Monroe, the lead flight attendant, moved with a deliberate pace that demanded attention. Her blonde hair was pulled into a severe twist, her crisp uniform pressed to perfection. Rachel's pale blue eyes swept over the cabin, lingering a second too long on Evelyn. The glance wasn't overtly hostile, but there was a cool assessment in it, as if she were quietly deciding where each passenger fit in her mental hierarchy. Evelyn noticed the look but said nothing. She'd experienced these micro-assessments before, small judgments based on clothing, posture, the way she spoke. Today, she wore a soft blue cardigan over a simple floral dress, along with comfortable brown flats that had seen years of careful polishing. She didn't dress to impress. She dressed for the long hours ahead. Rachel began checking the overhead bins, pausing at Evelyn's row. Her eyes darted to the open bin above 2A. She reached up, adjusted Evelyn's carry-on bag, then looked down at her with a tight smile. "Is this your bag, ma'am?" she asked. Evelyn nodded. Yes, it is. I made sure it fits just fine. Rachel's gaze slid to the side pocket, where the top of the inhaler case was just visible. Her smile thinned. And what's that in the side compartment? My asthma inhaler, Evelyn replied calmly. I always keep it close in case I need it. Rachel straightened, her tone sharpening slightly. For security reasons, passengers are not allowed to carry certain aerosol devices without prior declaration. Did you inform the gate agent? It's a prescribed inhaler, Evelyn said, keeping her voice even. I've carried it on dozens of flights. It's essential for my breathing. Rachel gave a slow nod, but her expression didn't soften. We'll need to review it before departure. Evelyn felt a small pinch of anxiety in her chest, not from the asthma, but from the tone. There was a confidence in Rachel's voice, the kind that brooked no disagreement. Evelyn drew in a steadying breath and reminded herself of her son's advice, words he'd repeated to her many times. Stay calm, even if they push you. Of course, Evelyn said simply, retrieving the inhaler from her purse and placing it in her lap. Rachel studied it as though it were an unfamiliar artifact. She turned it in her hand, then looked back at Evelyn. Do you have medical documentation for this, yes? Evelyn replied, holding up her left wrist. The silver medical ID bracelet caught the overhead light, its engraving clearly visible. This has my condition and emergency information. Rachel leaned closer, peering at the bracelet for no more than a second. That could be costume jewelry, she said, straightening again. Anyone could wear one of those. The comment stung. Evelyn blinked slowly, keeping her expression neutral. It's not, she said softly. But I understand you have to be careful. Rachel's eyes narrowed. Exactly. We can't take risks. She turned, placing the inhaler on her service tray as she moved to the next passenger. Evelyn watched her go, her mind turning over the exchange. She told herself not to jump to conclusions, yet something in Rachel's demeanor felt less like protocol and more like judgment. The quiet comfort she'd felt moments ago was slipping away, replaced by an unease that settled in her stomach. Across the aisle, Dr. Thomas Nguyen had been watching, a man in his early 60s with kind eyes behind thin-rimmed glasses. He had introduced himself to the businesswoman beside him as a retired physician. He glanced at Evelyn, then at the inhaler in Rachel's hand as she moved away. His brow furrowed slightly. He had seen this sort of thing before, small power plays that could escalate. Behind them, Sophia Martinez adjusted her phone in her seat pocket. A freelance journalist and avid live streamer, she had a knack for spotting stories before anyone else did. The subtle tension between the older woman in 2A and the immaculate lead flight attendant had already caught her attention. Evelyn shifted in her seat, trying to settle her thoughts. She told herself not to let this bother her, not when she had more pressing emotions to manage. In less than 7 hours, she would be standing beside her sister's casket. She could not afford to let a stranger's suspicion steal more of her peace. Still, her mind wandered back to the inhaler sitting on Rachel's tray. It was a lifeline, not a luxury. The recycled air was already tinged with that faint, dry tang that always made her throat tighten. She glanced toward the galley, wondering how long the review would take. The engines hummed louder, the cabin lights dimming slightly as boarding continued. A father lifted his young daughter into a seat in row 4. Overhead compartments clicked shut. The air felt just a shade cooler. Evelyn folded her hands in her lap and focused on her breathing. slow and steady. One thing she knew for certain on airplanes: situations could shift quickly, and this one had the faint scent of trouble. She didn't know yet just how far it would go. The boarding door closed with a soft mechanical thud, and the murmur of the terminal faded away. The hum of the engines deepened, a steady vibration under the soles of Evelyn Carter's feet. She adjusted her seat belt, feeling the faint press of the metal clasp against her waist. Outside her window, the late afternoon light washed the tarmac in shades of orange and gold. It should have been a calming moment, the quiet pause before the long journey west, but her eyes kept drifting toward the galley, where Rachel Monroe had disappeared with her inhaler. Evelyn took a slow breath, willing herself to focus on the steady rhythm of the engines. Across the aisle, Dr. Thomas Nunyon was reading the in-flight safety card, though his glances toward the galley were frequent and deliberate. Behind them, Sophia Martinez shifted in her seat and adjusted her phone. Her camera was angled just enough to capture the front half of the cabin without drawing attention. The first-class cabin was nearly full. The businesswoman in 2B typed rapidly on a tablet. The man in 3A was flipping through a glossy magazine. A young couple in row 1 whispered to each other, oblivious to the undercurrent running through the space. Evelyn tried to tell herself that Rachel's inspection was just routine, nothing more. But deep down, she felt the beginnings of unease curling in her stomach. A few minutes later, Rachel emerged from the galley, her expression unreadable. She approached Evelyn's seat with the same crisp, deliberate steps as before, the heels of her shoes clicking softly against the carpet. In one hand, she held the inhaler. In the other, a small laminated card. "Mrs. Carter," she began, her tone cool and professional. "I've reviewed this item, and it does not appear to comply with Aurora Skyway's onboard safety guidelines." Evelyn blinked. "It's a prescription inhaler," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I've been carrying this for years, without a problem." Rachel glanced at the laminated card as if confirming her position. "Our guidelines require that all aerosol-based devices be declared and verified prior to boarding. Since this was not declared, it cannot remain in your possession during the flight." Evelyn's fingers tightened on the armrest. "I told you, it's a medical device. I have a documented condition. You saw my medical ID bracelet." Rachel's lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. "Those bracelets can be purchased anywhere. I need official documentation." The businesswoman in 2B glanced up from her tablet, her brow furrowed. Dr. Nguyen leaned forward slightly in his seat. "Ma'am," he said in a measured tone, "I'm a physician. That is a standard rescue inhaler. There's no safety risk in allowing her to keep it." Rachel turned her gaze on him, polite but with an edge. "Sir, unless you are a member of the crew, I must ask you not to interfere with our safety protocols." Dr. Nguyen's jaw tightened, but he said nothing further for the moment. Sophia, however, had subtly tapped her phone screen. Her live stream was running now, the tiny red dot glowing in the corner of her display. Her viewers could already sense the tension in her voice as she quietly narrated what was unfolding. Evelyn's heartbeat had quickened. She could feel the dryness in the back of her throat, a faint tightness in her chest that she knew too well. She kept her tone even. "I cannot breathe properly without that inhaler. You are taking away something I need for my health. Please return it." Rachel held the inhaler just out of reach. "I will store it safely and return it after we land. provided there are no issues during the flight. That is not acceptable, Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a low, steady register. If I have an asthma attack mid-flight, I will not be able to wait hours for you to give it back. A few rows back, a man cleared his throat uncomfortably. The couple in row 1 exchanged a glance. The cabin was quieter now, the hum of the engines filling the space between words. Rachel shifted her weight, clearly aware that passengers were watching. "We have oxygen on board for emergencies," she said. "You will be fine." "That's not how asthma works," Dr. Nguyen interjected again, his voice firmer this time. "Withholding prescribed medication can be life-threatening." Rachel's eyes hardened. "Sir, this is your final warning. Please remain in your seat and allow me to perform my duties." Evelyn's mind flickered to the reason she was on this flight. The image of her sister's smile framed by the warm light of their childhood kitchen. The thought of not making it there, of collapsing in her seat while strangers looked on, sent a wave of dread through her. She met Rachel's gaze steadily. "You are making a dangerous mistake." Rachel's response was swift. "Mrs. Carter, I've been working in aviation for 15 years. I can recognize when passengers attempt to circumvent safety regulations. I am confident in my decision." The words hung in the air like a closing door. Evelyn sat back slowly, her eyes on the inhaler in Rachel's hand. She could feel every beat of her pulse, each one a reminder that time and air were not things to take for granted. Sophia's phone screen lit up with comments from viewers. The phrases scrolled quickly. "This is unacceptable. That's medical neglect." "What's the airline thinking?" Her audience was growing by the minute. Rachel turned away, moving toward the galley again, the inhaler still in her grasp. Dr. Nguyen exhaled heavily, leaning toward Evelyn. "I'll keep an eye on you," he said quietly. "If your breathing changes, I'll intervene." Evelyn nodded once, grateful for his presence. She tried to focus on the sound of her own breathing, counting the seconds between each inhale and exhale. The cabin felt warmer now, the air just a little more stale. In the back of her mind, she could hear her son Daniel's voice from a phone call just last week. "If anyone challenges you, stay calm. Document what you can. I'll always be a call away." She had smiled then, touched by his protectiveness. Now, she wondered if she might need to test that promise sooner than she had ever imagined, as Rachel disappeared behind the curtain of the galley. Sophia tilted her phone slightly and whispered for her viewers. "Something's happening here, and it's not right. I'll keep recording." Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. The engines roared a little louder, and the plane began to inch backward from the gate. She told herself she would make it through this flight, that she would reach San Francisco and stand beside her sister one last time. But she also knew that the wrong decision, made in this very moment, could change everything. The plane had pushed back from the gate and was taxiing slowly across the tarmac. The low rumble of the engines vibrated through the seat back, and the familiar faint pressure built in Evelyn Carter's ears. She sat still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes on the window. Beyond the glass, rows of aircraft waited in line for departure, their navigation lights winking in the gathering dusk. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had tightened. Passengers spoke in hushed tones, or not at all, as though the earlier exchange had cast a shadow no one wanted to acknowledge. Evelyn's throat felt dry. She could sense the faint, creeping constriction in her airways, the kind that warned her she might need her inhaler soon. She shifted her gaze to the galley curtain. Rachel Monroe had not returned. The inhaler was still out of reach, in the seat across the aisle. Dr. Thomas Noyan watched her with quiet concern. He caught her eye and gave a small nod, as if to say he was still there, ready to step in. Behind them, Sophia Martinez's phone rested at an angle that captured the front rows. She was speaking softly into her microphone, updating her growing audience. A minute later, the curtain swished aside. Rachel emerged, her expression composed but with a certain tightness around the eyes. She approached Evelyn's seat with the same deliberate pace, stopping just close enough to look down at her. "Mrs. Carter," she said in a voice that carried just far enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I have decided to hold this device for the duration of the flight." Evelyn looked up at her, keeping her tone calm. "You are withholding prescribed medical treatment from a passenger with a documented condition." Rachel's gaze hardened. "You did not follow proper procedure. I cannot allow this on board without verification. You can retrieve it once we land." Evelyn's chest tightened further, her breathing slightly shallower. She knew she had to choose her words carefully. "If I have an asthma attack mid-flight, your delay in returning this could cause serious harm." Rachel's reply was sharp, her voice pitched just high enough to draw glances from nearby seats. "I will not be manipulated by theatrics. We have oxygen on board. You will be fine." A ripple of discomfort moved through the cabin. The businesswoman in 2B lowered her tablet and stared openly. The man in 3A shifted in his seat. A child in row 4 asked his mother in a whisper why the lady in front looked upset. Evelyn's fingers gripped the armrest, knuckles pale. She could feel the sting of humiliation rising in her chest, mingling with the physical discomfort. Her mind flashed to her sister, to the funeral waiting on the other end of this journey, and she felt the weight of injustice pressing down. Rachel took a step closer, and in a moment that would burn into Evelyn's memory, she reached out and tapped the inhaler against her palm as if to emphasize her control. Then, without warning, she leaned in slightly, her face close, and said in a tone that was almost mocking, "You really should be more careful about what you bring on board." The comment was accompanied by a brisk pat on Evelyn's shoulder, not hard enough to hurt, but dismissive in a way that left Evelyn frozen. It was the kind of gesture that said, without words, that Rachel did not see her as deserving of respect. Evelyn straightened slowly, meeting Rachel's eyes. "I will remember this moment," she said quietly. Rachel's lips pressed into a thin smile. "As you wish." From the corner of her eye, Evelyn saw Sophia angle her phone slightly. The red recording light glowed, and in the small reflection of the window, Evelyn realized the incident was being broadcast in real time. She wondered how many strangers were watching her dignity be chipped away. "Dr." Nguyen rose from his seat, his voice steady but edged with authority. "Lead flight attendant or not, you're endangering a passenger's life. I insist you return her medication now." Rachel pivoted toward him, her posture rigid. "Sit down, sir. This is crew business. Interfering with my duties can result in your removal from the flight." The doctor's mouth opened to reply, but Evelyn raised a hand subtly, signaling for him to wait. She could feel her own pulse in her temples, but she was determined not to let anger take the lead. Anger clouded judgment. She needed clarity now. The cabin had fallen nearly silent. The only sounds were the steady drone of the engines and the faint rustle of a passenger turning a page in a magazine. Somewhere in the back, a baby whimpered, then quieted. Rachel turned away and began walking toward the front of the cabin, the inhaler still in her hand. Evelyn watched her go, each step feeling like another small theft of her autonomy. She had faced worse in her lifetime, subtle exclusions at stores, questions about her competence when she was decades younger, but the sting of prejudice never lost its sharpness. It had a way of making even the most accomplished person feel suddenly small. She took a long, careful breath, letting it out slowly. The sensation in her chest had not worsened, but it had not eased either. She was aware of every molecule of air entering her lungs. Across the aisle, Dr. Nguyen gave her a look that blended frustration and resolve. In row 3, the man with the magazine slipped his phone from his pocket, pretending to read while his camera lens pointed discreetly forward. The businesswoman in 2B pulled her scarf tighter around her neck, as if trying to hide from the discomfort unfolding beside her. Sophia's voice, low but insistent, carried just enough for Evelyn to hear. If you're watching this, share it. This isn't just about one passenger. This is about how easily people can abuse their authority. Evelyn's thoughts were a swirl now. She thought about calling her son, but a part of her resisted. Daniel had a demanding role, managing the operations of an entire airline network. She hated the idea of disrupting him unless it was truly necessary. Yet, as she sat there, the dry air filling her lungs without relief, she wondered how much longer she could wait. Rachel reappeared briefly, moving briskly toward the cockpit. The small laminated card was still in her hand. Evelyn could not hear her words, but the captain's head tilted slightly as she spoke. Then Rachel turned back, her eyes flicking over Evelyn's seat without slowing. Evelyn looked down at her hands. They were steady, but her heart felt heavy. She had been on countless flights and countless situations where she was just another face in the crowd. But today, she was a problem to be managed, a suspect without cause, and she could feel the shift in the air. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a decision, and Rachel had made it. The plane slowed as it reached the end of the taxiway, the engines rising in pitch in preparation for takeoff. Evelyn settled back into her seat, the safety announcement droning overhead. The words felt distant, almost unreal, as if she were watching someone else's flight. She closed her eyes briefly, focusing on the simple act of drawing air into her lungs, one breath at a time. She would not break here, not in front of them, but she knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The aircraft lifted from the runway with a smooth surge of power, pressing Evelyn Carter gently back into her seat. The skyline of New York slipped away beneath a haze of late evening light. Ordinarily, she would glance out at the view, maybe even let herself be distracted by the distant twinkle of the city. But her eyes remained fixed on the curtain separating the galley from the cabin. Somewhere beyond it, her inhaler sat in the hands of someone who did not believe she deserved it. The dry air flowing from the overhead vent made her throat itch. She adjusted the vent slightly, directing it away from her face. It helped, but only a little. The familiar tightness in her chest was still there, like a soft fist curling slowly inward. She sat very still, trying to mask the effort it took to draw a full breath. Across the aisle, Dr. Thomas Nunyon had put away the safety card. His hands were clasped loosely in his lap, but his gaze was steady on Evelyn. He had seen enough medical emergencies in his life to recognize the signs. He had also seen enough human behavior to recognize something else when rules were being used as a shield for bias. Rachel Monroe returned from the cockpit, her stride brisk. She stopped briefly at row 1 to check on the couple seated there, smiling in a way that seemed reserved for them alone. Then she approached Evelyn's row again, her expression hardening. "How are we feeling?" Mrs. Carter Rachel asked, the question loaded with formality rather than concern. Evelyn met her gaze. "I would feel much better with my medication." Rachel's mouth twitched. "I told you. It will be returned after we land." Before Evelyn could reply, Dr. Nguyen's voice cut in, calm but unmistakably firm. "This is unacceptable. I am a licensed physician, retired after 35 years of practice. I am telling you that withholding her inhaler could trigger a life-threatening event. You must return it now." Rachel turned her attention to him, her tone clipped. "Doctor or not, I am responsible for this cabin. If you continue to interfere, I will have to report you for disruptive behavior." Dr. Nguyen leaned slightly forward, his voice carrying just enough to reach nearby passengers. "Interfering. I'm trying to prevent a preventable medical crisis. That is my duty as a physician and as a human being." A low murmur spread through the first-class section. The businesswoman in 2B exchanged a glance with the man in 3A. Sophia Martinez adjusted her phone slightly, making sure both Evelyn and Dr. Nguyen were in frame. Her viewers were already flooding the chat with outrage. Rachel straightened, clearly aware that eyes were on her. "Mrs. Carter appears to be breathing just fine. If there is an emergency, we have oxygen available. Oxygen will not resolve bronchospasm," Dr. Nguyen countered immediately. "Asthma medication will. This is basic medicine." Evelyn felt a swell of gratitude toward the doctor, but also a pang of unease. She knew Rachel would see his defense as defiance, and defiance was something the lead attendant seemed determined to crush. Evelyn had been on the receiving end of such stubborn authority before, outside of airplanes and in much larger arenas. It never ended easily. Rachel's jaw tightened. "Doctor, I will remind you that safety protocol gives the crew the final say in such matters. And I will remind you, Doctor," Nguyen replied, "that the Americans with Disabilities Act and FAA regulations require you to accommodate passengers with documented medical needs." Rachel's eyes flashed, but she didn't answer. Instead, she turned back to Evelyn. "Mrs. Carter, are you experiencing any severe difficulty right now?" Evelyn took a slow breath. It was not yet dire, but it was far from comfortable. "Not yet," she said evenly, "but I am aware of my own condition. I know how quickly it can turn." Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. "Then you will notify me if that changes." With that, she turned and walked back toward the galley, the curtain swishing closed behind her. The cabin seemed to exhale collectively. Dr. Nguyen shook his head and muttered something under his breath. Sophia leaned across the aisle just enough to catch Evelyn's eye. "The stream is going crazy," she whispered. "Thousands of people are watching. They're furious." Evelyn offered a faint smile. "Maybe that will matter." The seatbelt sign dinged off, and a few passengers stood to retrieve items from the overhead bins. Evelyn remained seated, conserving her energy. She sipped from the small bottle of water the gate agent had given her earlier, letting the coolness soothe her dry throat. Minutes passed, the tightness in her chest did not ease. She shifted slightly in her seat, trying to find a position that made breathing feel less effortful. Dr. Nguyen noticed and leaned in. "You're getting tighter," he said quietly. "Do you feel it?" "Yes," Evelyn admitted. "It's not yet dangerous, but it's moving in that direction." The doctor's eyes narrowed. "I'm not going to let this slide." He stood, moving toward the galley. A flight attendant stationed near the curtain tried to block him politely, but he stepped around her with quiet authority. Moments later, raised voices could be heard from behind the curtain. Rachel's sharper tones were distinct, even if the words were not clear. When Dr. Nguyen returned, his expression was grim. "She refuses. She claims she's following security procedure." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. It was not surprise she felt, but a heavier emotion disappointment, not just in Rachel, but in the passengers who avoided looking at them, who sat silently as the situation unfolded. She understood fear of confrontation. She also knew that silence in the face of wrong was its own kind of choice. Sophia's voice carried again, soft but insistent. "For those watching, you're seeing this in real time. This woman needs her inhaler. She's being denied it. This could become an emergency, and the crew is ignoring a licensed doctor's advice." Evelyn looked at the young woman. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. Sophia's eyes met hers. "Because too many people get away with this kind of thing when no one's watching." Evelyn thought of her son again, of his calm voice telling her to document, to speak up. She wished she could tell him now, wished she could hear his measured assurance. But for the moment, she sat in the narrow confines of her seat, the sound of the engines surrounding her, waiting for the next turn in a situation that was already far beyond what it should have been. Somewhere above the clouds, in the sealed space of that cabin, the battle lines had quietly been drawn. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight settled into cruising altitude. The sound of the engines became a steady backdrop, almost like a low, constant drumbeat. Evelyn Carter sat motionless in 2A, her hands resting gently in her lap. She had not moved much since the exchange with Rachel Monroe, partly because she was conserving her energy and partly because every movement seemed to draw more eyes in her direction. The dryness in her throat had deepened. She took a slow sip of water, the coolness giving her temporary relief, but she could feel the tightening in her chest continuing its slow, deliberate progress. It was not yet urgent, but the edge was there, and she knew her body well enough to recognize the warning signs. Then, from inside her purse, a sound cut through the quiet murmur of the cabin, the bright, insistent chime of her phone. The vibration against the fabric of the bag made a faint, rattling sound. Evelyn reached for it instinctively, but her fingers hesitated halfway. She glanced at the small screen as it lit up. Daniel Carter. Her son's name glowed in crisp white letters against the dark background. She felt a wave of emotion at the sight of it, relief, longing, and an ache that came from knowing she could not easily explain what was happening. She began to reach for the phone, but before she could lift it fully, a shadow fell across her seat. Rachel stood there, her expression unreadable but her eyes sharp. "Phones must remain on airplane mode during the flight," she said flatly. "You are not permitted to take calls." Evelyn's fingers curled slightly around the edge of her purse. "It's my son," she said, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of urgency. "I need to tell him you can speak to him when we land." Rachel interrupted, holding up a hand as if to stop the words themselves. "Right now. You are a passenger under review for possible safety violations." Evelyn's eyes searched Rachel's face for a trace of understanding. "I am also a passenger with a medical condition, and he is my emergency contact." Rachel's jaw tightened. "The rules are the rules." Across the aisle, Doctor. Thomas Noyen shifted in his seat. "She should be allowed to answer that call," he said firmly. "I can see her breathing is more labored than before." Rachel's head turned toward him. Her tone clipped. "Doctor, this is your second warning about interference." But in that moment, the phone rang again in the same tone, the same persistent vibration. The name on the screen had not changed. Daniel Carter. Evelyn's fingers trembled slightly as she reached once more for the purse. Before Rachel could object, Dr. Nguyen leaned forward. "Let her answer," he said, his voice carrying enough weight to turn several heads in the cabin. Rachel's eyes narrowed. "If she answers that call, I will have to. She is my patient right now," Dr. Nguyen said, cutting her off, "and I am instructing her to take it." The standoff was brief but tense. Rachel hesitated, clearly calculating her next move. In the end, she took a single step back, though her posture remained stiff. Evelyn lifted the phone from her purse. Her thumb hovered over the answer icon. She pressed it, then quickly switched to speaker mode. A familiar voice filled the small space around her seat. Mom, why haven't you been answering? Are you all right?" The sound of her son's voice hit her like a warm current in cold water. "Daniel," she said, her own voice trembling slightly. "I can't breathe as well as I should. They took my medicine." For a moment, there was silence on the other end. Then his tone changed, hardening with precision. "What do you mean? They took it?" Who is they before she could answer? Rachel spoke sharply, as if to reclaim control. "This passenger is under review for carrying an undeclared aerosol device. It will be returned after the flight." There was another pause, but when Daniel spoke again, his voice was colder, more deliberate. "This is Daniel Carter, Senior Vice President of Flight Operations for Aurora Skyways. Who am I speaking to right now?" The words landed in the cabin like a sudden drop in altitude. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Even the businesswoman in 2B lowered her tablet completely. Rachel's composure faltered. "I am the lead flight attendant, Rachel Monroe." "Ms. Monroe," Daniel said, his tone clipped. "You have withheld prescribed emergency medication from a passenger who is also my mother. A licensed physician is telling you she is at risk, and you are telling me this is your protocol." Rachel swallowed, her voice less certain now. It was not declared. Daniel's voice cut cleanly through hers. "You have 30 seconds to return that inhaler to her. If you do not, I will have this flight halted at the nearest gate, and you will be removed from service before it reaches the runway." The stillness in the cabin was almost physical. Sophia Martinez's phone captured every syllable, her viewers now exploding with comments that moved so fast she could barely read them. Dr. Nguyen's expression was one of quiet satisfaction, though his eyes stayed on Evelyn's breathing. Rachel glanced toward the galley, then back at Evelyn. "I will retrieve it." Daniel's voice was still on speaker. "Stay with her until she has it. Do not put it in her hands from a distance. You will walk it over." Rachel gave a tight nod and turned toward the galley. The curtain swished closed behind her. For a long moment, the only sounds were the steady drone of the engines and the faint hum of an overhead light. Evelyn kept the phone close. "Daniel," she said softly, "I didn't want to involve you." "You called me by answering," he replied. "Now let me do what I have to do." Less than a minute later, Rachel returned, the inhaler resting in her palm. Her movements were deliberate as she placed it directly into Evelyn's hand. "Here." Evelyn accepted it without looking away from her son's name on the screen. "Thank you," she said quietly. Daniel's voice was calm now, but still carrying the edge of command. "Use it, Mom." She raised it to her mouth, pressing the inhaler, drawing the medication deep into her lungs. The relief was almost immediate. The tightness eased. Air flowed more freely, and the faint dizziness at the edge of her vision receded. "That's better," she murmured. "Doctor," Nguyen nodded. "Color's coming back into your face." Daniel spoke again. "I'm going to meet you when you land." And Ms. Monroe Rachel froze in place. "Yes, you and I will have a conversation that you will not forget." The call ended, but the echo of his voice seemed to linger in the cabin. Evelyn set the phone gently in her lap, her fingers curling around the inhaler. Around her, passengers exchanged quiet glances, some of them tinged with respect, others with discomfort. The balance of power had shifted, and Evelyn could feel, deep in her bones, that the flight ahead would not be a quiet one. Rachel Monroe stood frozen for a moment after Daniel Carter's voice disappeared from the phone speaker. The expression on her face was difficult to read, part defiance, part dawning realization. She had just been challenged in front of an entire first-class cabin, not by a difficult passenger, but by the son of that passenger, who also happened to hold one of the most powerful positions in the airline's operations. The curtain at the galley swayed slightly as another attendant, a younger man with dark hair and concerned eyes, peeked through. His name tag read Miles Turner. His gaze shifted between Evelyn Carter, Dr. Nguyen, and Rachel. He seemed hesitant, as though weighing whether to step in. Evelyn inhaled again from her inhaler, letting the medication reach deep into her lungs. The sharpness in her chest eased further, and she closed her eyes briefly in relief. When she opened them, she noticed that the atmosphere in the cabin had changed. Passengers who had been looking away earlier were now watching openly. Their eyes carried a mix of curiosity, discomfort, and something else, anticipation. Rachel adjusted the cuff of her uniform jacket, then turned toward the galley. "Continue service," she said to Miles, her voice clipped. Miles hesitated. "Rachel, maybe we should talk to the captain." Her eyes narrowed. "Service. Miles." But as she started toward the galley again, the intercom above her head chimed softly. A calm male voice filled the cabin. "Lead flight attendant to the cockpit. Please, lead flight attendant to the cockpit." Rachel's head turned toward the closed cockpit door. She smoothed her uniform again and walked briskly forward. The latch clicked, and she disappeared inside. Dr. Nguyen leaned slightly toward Evelyn. "I suspect your son is already speaking to the captain." Evelyn offered a faint smile. "Daniel doesn't waste time." Sophia Martinez was still holding her phone at an angle, her live stream capturing every subtle shift in the cabin. The viewer count in the corner of her screen had tripled since takeoff. The comments scrolled too fast to read, but she could catch occasional words: outrage, share, unacceptable. Miles approached Evelyn's row quietly. "Mrs. Carter, is there anything you need right now? Water? A blanket?" Evelyn studied him for a moment. His tone was sincere, his eyes direct. I'm all right now. Thank you." He nodded once, then stepped back. His presence felt different from Rachel's, less about authority, more about actual care. The cockpit door opened again, and Rachel emerged. Her face was carefully neutral, but there was a tightness in her movements. She walked straight to Evelyn's seat and lowered herself slightly so she was at eye level. "The captain has been informed of your son's position and concerns," she said. "We are continuing to our destination, but I have been instructed to ensure your comfort and safety." Evelyn met her gaze evenly. "That is appreciated." Rachel straightened and moved on without further comment, but the slight flush in her cheeks betrayed her. Miles began service in first class, offering drinks and light snacks. The tension had not vanished, but it had shifted. There was now an undercurrent of quiet watchfulness. Passengers seemed to be weighing every action, every tone of voice from the crew. Evelyn sipped more water and let her mind wander. She thought about her sister's funeral, waiting for her in Atlanta, about the long years between them and the childhood they had shared in a small southern town. She remembered how her sister used to say that dignity was not given. It was held even when others tried to strip it away. She also thought about Daniel, how calm and deliberate his voice had been, how quickly he had moved from son to strategist. She knew his job required him to balance diplomacy with authority, but she had never heard him use that tone with someone who held power over a situation he could not immediately control. She felt a flicker of pride, and yet, beneath it, there was a twinge of worry. She knew how much Daniel valued his reputation for fairness, and she feared this incident would force him into a fight he could not avoid. Rachel kept her distance for the next 20 minutes, busying herself with other passengers. But Evelyn noticed that whenever Rachel moved through the cabin, her eyes flickered toward her row, almost reflexively. Evelyn could not tell if it was caution or calculation. Dr. Nguyen checked on her breathing periodically, his manner gentle but professional. "You're stable now," he said quietly, "but if you feel any constriction returning, tell me immediately." "I will," Evelyn promised. The cabin had settled into a strange kind of equilibrium when the intercom chimed again. This time, the captain's voice came through directly, calm and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Aaron Blake. We will be making a brief stop at Charlotte Douglas International before continuing to Atlanta. This is for operational reasons, and we appreciate your patience." The reaction was immediate. A ripple of murmurs, questions whispered between seatmates, raised eyebrows. Operational reasons was the kind of phrase that could mean almost anything. Evelyn felt the shift in the air again, a sense of expectancy. Rachel's posture stiffened. She turned toward the cockpit for a brief moment, then resumed service. But her pace had quickened. Miles, on the other hand, seemed almost relieved. He moved down the aisle with unhurried efficiency, as though the announcement had removed some invisible weight from his shoulders. Sophia looked directly at Evelyn. "That's not a coincidence," she said softly. Evelyn didn't answer, but she knew Sophia was right. Daniel had made a call, and the system was moving. The descent into Charlotte was smooth, the cabin quiet except for the occasional clink of glasses being cleared. When the plane rolled to a stop at the gate, the seatbelt sign remained on, and the doors stayed closed. Through the window, Evelyn could see a small group of uniformed personnel approaching the aircraft from the jet bridge. Rachel's smile when she addressed the cabin was professional, but her voice carried a faint edge. "Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We will be on the ground briefly." 2 men in dark blazers stepped into the cabin, their ID badges clipped to their lapels. They spoke quietly to Rachel, who nodded, her expression stiff. Then they moved to the front row and began speaking with the couple in 1A. Whatever was being said, the couple looked surprised but not alarmed. Miles appeared beside Evelyn's seat. His voice was low enough that only she and Dr. Nguyen could hear. "Mrs. Carter, when we disembark in Atlanta, there will be someone waiting for you. Your son has arranged it." Evelyn gave him a small nod. "Thank you, Miles." The 2 men in blazers left as quickly as they had arrived. The doors closed again, and the aircraft pushed back from the gate. The whole stop had taken less than 15 minutes, but the effect on the cabin was lasting. Conversations were quieter now, movements more deliberate. Evelyn leaned back, inhaler resting loosely in her hand. She felt no gloating, only a quiet steadiness. This was not about winning a moment. It was about reclaiming what should never have been taken in the first place. And she knew, as the engines roared for takeoff once more, that this was not the end of the confrontation. It was merely the first turn in a larger tide. The aircraft climbed once more, the engines settling into their steady hum as the lights of Charlotte disappeared into the night. From her seat, Evelyn Carter could feel the shift in the air not just from altitude, but from tension. Something invisible had been set in motion. People were quieter, but their glances were sharper, lingering on the crew a little longer, whispering in tones that carried just far enough for her to catch fragments. She held the inhaler loosely in her right hand, feeling its smooth plastic against her palm. It was more than a medical device now. It was proof that something wrong had happened, and that it had taken the voice of her son, reaching in from hundreds of miles away, to set it right. Rachel Monroe returned to first class with a tray of drinks. Her posture was impeccable. But Evelyn noticed the way her gaze flitted past certain passengers avoiding eye contact with Dr. Nguyen, skimming over Sophia, landing briefly on Evelyn before moving on. It was a kind of dance, one she'd seen before in boardrooms and courtrooms, the careful steps of someone who knew they had made a mistake, but had not yet decided whether to admit it. Miles Turner moved behind her, offering quiet smiles and soft words as he served. When he reached Evelyn's row, he crouched slightly, speaking just for her. "Mrs. Carter, how's your breathing now?" "Better," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "Thank you for asking." He nodded, then glanced toward Rachel before adding, "The captain knows everything now." Evelyn looked at him more closely. Everything. Miles hesitated, as though weighing the risk. Your son's position, the live stream, the doctor's testimony, it's all been relayed. Evelyn's lips curved into the faintest smile. Then the flight is not the only thing in motion. He returned her smile before moving on, his professionalism unshaken. Across the aisle, Sophia was still streaming quietly. Her chat had become a rolling wave of outrage and solidarity. She held her phone low, but Evelyn could see the viewer count numbers climbing steadily. Sophia met her eyes and mouthed, "Almost 50,000. Evelyn exhaled slowly. It was not the attention she wanted, but she understood its value. People could ignore a complaint lodged in private. They could not as easily ignore the same injustice playing out live for tens of thousands. Rachel's voice broke the silence, directed toward Dr. Nguyen this time. "Would you care for anything to drink?" Doctor. Nguyen's reply was polite but cool. just water. And I would also care for an explanation as to why my medical judgment was ignored earlier. Rachel's smile was thin. I followed the procedures I believed were necessary at the time. That, Dr. Nguyen said, taking the glass from her, is not the same as following the right procedure. The words hung in the air as Rachel moved away, her smile faltering for just a moment. Evelyn leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes briefly. Behind her lids, memories surfaced, unbidden moments from decades past when she had been told to wait her turn, to be patient, to accept less than she deserved because it was easier for others. The difference now was that she had the means, through her son and through witnesses, to push back. The chime of the intercom interrupted her thoughts. "Mrs. Carter," the captain's voice said evenly. "When you have a moment, I would like to speak with you privately in the galley." A ripple moved through the first-class cabin. Passengers turned their heads subtly, curious. Evelyn opened her eyes and met Dr. Nguyen's gaze. He gave her a small nod of encouragement. She rose slowly, inhaler still in hand, and walked toward the galley. The curtain closed behind her, shutting out the eyes and ears of the cabin. Captain Aaron Blake stood there, his uniform crisp, his expression calm but attentive. Beside him stood a man in a dark blazer with an airline security badge clipped to the pocket. "Mrs. Carter," the captain said, "I wanted to assure you that I have been fully briefed on the incident. I understand your son has spoken with you." "Yes," she replied, her tone polite but measured. "He called because I could not breathe properly and my medication had been taken from me." The captain's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That should never have happened. "I have already initiated an in-flight incident report. Upon arrival in Atlanta, you will be met by both operations management and corporate relations." The man in the blazer stepped forward slightly. "I will also be speaking with you, Mrs. Carter, to document your account for our internal investigation." Evelyn met his gaze steadily. "I will give you my account, but understand, this is not just about me." The captain inclined his head. "I understand, and I can assure you this will be taken seriously." She held his eyes for a moment longer, then gave a small nod. "Good. Then I will return to my seat." As she walked back down the aisle, she felt the weight of every pair of eyes on her. She sat, smoothing her skirt, and placed the inhaler gently in her lap. Sophia leaned across slightly. "Was that the captain?" "Yes," Evelyn said. And Evelyn replied, "He is listening." The rest of the flight passed with a quiet tension that never fully dissipated. Rachel kept her distance, her movements precise and efficient. Miles continued to offer small gestures of care, a refill of water, an extra blanket. Dr. Nguyen checked on her one last time, satisfied that her breathing was stable. When the landing announcement came, Evelyn felt her heart pick up its pace, not from fear, but from anticipation. The wheels touched down in Atlanta with a soft jolt, the reverse thrusters humming briefly before fading. The cabin lights brightened, and the seatbelt sign chimed off. Passengers began to gather their belongings, but Rachel's voice came over the PA. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated until our special assistance team has escorted a passenger from the aircraft." The phrasing was careful. It did not say which passenger, but Evelyn knew. She also knew it was not the kind of assistance most people imagined. She stayed seated as the others remained in place. Through the front curtain, she could see figures waiting on the jet bridge, two in suits. one in an airline security uniform, and there, just behind them, was a familiar silhouette. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with quiet authority. Daniel. Evelyn's fingers closed around her inhaler as the door opened and the figures stepped inside. The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Daniel Carter stepped into the cabin with the kind of presence that changed the air. He did not raise his voice, he did not rush, but every passenger could feel the weight he carried. He was dressed in a dark tailored suit, the kind that looked effortless but was chosen with care. His expression was calm, but his eyes were unyielding. Evelyn Carter watched him approach from her seat in 2A. For a moment, their eyes met, and she felt the kind of reassurance only a son's presence could bring. Daniel stopped at her row, resting one hand lightly on the seat back in front of her. "Are you all right, Mom?" he asked quietly. "I am now," she said, inhaler still resting in her palm. "Thanks to Dr. Nguyen and to you." Daniel gave a small nod to the retired physician. "Doctor, I appreciate your intervention." Dr. Nguyen inclined his head. She needed help. It was the right thing to do. Daniel straightened, his gaze shifting toward the front of the cabin. "Where is Ms. Monroe?" Rachel emerged from the galley, posture stiff. "I'm here." Daniel's eyes fixed on her with a quiet intensity. "We need to speak. Here, in front of these passengers." Rachel blinked, clearly thrown off. "Perhaps this is better handled privately." "No," Daniel said, his tone even but unyielding. "This happened in front of them. They deserve to see how it is addressed." A murmur passed through the cabin. Sophia angled her phone subtly, catching the exchange. The viewer count on her live stream ticked higher. Rachel crossed her arms lightly. "I followed procedures. You withheld emergency medication from a passenger in respiratory distress," Daniel said, his voice still calm. "And not just any passenger. My mother." Rachel's chin lifted slightly. "I had reason to suspect the item was a prohibited aerosol. It was not declared. And did you verify it before confiscating it?" Daniel asked. Her silence stretched a beat too long. "I asked a question. Ms. Monroe." Rachel's voice was quieter now. "No, I did not verify." Daniel let the pause hang, his gaze steady. "You also ignored the judgment of a licensed physician on this flight. That's not. You told him it was his second warning for interference." Daniel cut in, his tone sharpened just enough to silence her. "That is not just a procedural error. That is negligence. And it is discrimination." Rachel's jaw tightened. "Discrimination?" Daniel's voice remained even. "Yes. I have reviewed passenger testimonies and live footage from this flight already. Multiple accounts show a pattern in your language and tone toward my mother that you did not direct toward other passengers. I will not stand here and let you pretend otherwise." A ripple moved through the cabin again. Rachel's gaze darted toward the other passengers, as though looking for an ally. None met her eyes. Daniel took a step closer, lowering his voice so that it carried only enough for those nearby to hear. "Ms. Monroe, you are now relieved of duty for the remainder of this flight. You will step off this aircraft with me, and you will not return to active service until this incident has been fully investigated." Rachel's eyes widened slightly. "You can't, I can," Daniel said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "And I am." He turned to Miles. "Mr. Turner, you will assume lead duties for the remainder of the flight." Miles's eyes widened briefly. Then he straightened. "Yes, sir." Daniel looked back at Rachel. "Gather your belongings. Rachel stood motionless for a moment longer, as though weighing whether to resist. Then, with a visible swallow, she moved toward the galley to collect her items. Sophia whispered to Evelyn, "This is going viral right now." Evelyn didn't answer. She kept her gaze on her son, watching the quiet control in every movement. Rachel returned with her carry-on bag, her face pale but composed. Daniel gestured toward the aisle. "After you." The cabin remained silent as she walked toward the exit. The sound of her footsteps sharp in the stillness. When she passed Evelyn's seat, she hesitated, as though about to speak, but then thought better of it. She continued forward without a word. Daniel waited until she stepped onto the jet bridge before turning back to the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption to your flight this evening. I can assure you that Aurora Skyways will take every necessary step to address what has occurred. Thank you for your patience and for your understanding." There was a scattered murmur of acknowledgement. Some passengers nodded. A few even offered quiet applause. Daniel turned back to Evelyn. "I'll escort you off when the cabin clears." Evelyn shook her head gently. "You didn't have to do this in front of everyone." "Yes," Daniel said, lowering his voice. "I did. Because if I didn't, someone would say it didn't happen." He stayed by her side as passengers began to disembark. Miles moved through the aisle, thanking people for their cooperation, his voice steady despite the sudden change in command. Dr. Nguyen paused beside Evelyn's seat before leaving. "You have a remarkable son," he said. "I know," Evelyn replied with a small smile. When the last passenger had stepped into the jet bridge, Daniel offered his arm. Evelyn rose, taking it, her steps slow but steady. They walked together toward the exit, the cabin now empty except for Miles, who gave them a respectful nod. On the jet bridge, 2 corporate representatives in dark suits waited. Behind them stood an airline security officer. The air here was cooler, sharper, as though the climate control had been turned higher. "Mrs. Carter," one of the representatives said, "we are deeply sorry for what happened tonight. We will ensure your account is recorded in full and that you are transported to your final destination with the highest level of care." Daniel's gaze remained steady on them. "And you will begin that process now. I will be joining the debrief." The representatives nodded, already fallen into step. As they moved down the jet bridge, Evelyn felt a quiet strength settle over her. The night had been long, humiliating at moments, and exhausting, but it had also been a reminder that silence in the face of injustice was not an option, and that her son had inherited the same resolve she had spent her life living by. The air in the operations conference room felt different from the cabin, colder, sharper, with a faint hum from the overhead lights. Evelyn Carter sat at the long, polished table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Daniel stood beside her, jacket buttoned, posture steady. Across from them, 2 corporate representatives from Aurora Skyways were arranging papers, their movements brisk but careful. On the far wall, a large monitor glowed with the airline's logo, the words "Incident Review," immediate session beneath it. The corporate security officer from the jet bridge stood in the corner, silent but observant. Daniel broke the silence first. "We are recording this session. Mrs. Carter has my full representation, and I will be participating as Senior Vice President of Flight Operations." The older of the 2 representatives, a woman named Patricia Lane, gave a small nod. "Understood. Mr. Carter, Please know our priority is to gather a complete and accurate account of what occurred tonight." Evelyn's voice was calm, measured. It began shortly after boarding. I was seated in 2A when the lead flight attendant approached and questioned my carry-on bag. She removed my inhaler without verifying what it was. When I told her it was for my asthma, she insisted it needed to be stored away. She refused to return it even when I began experiencing shortness of breath. Patricia glanced at the second representative, a younger man named Lucas Green, who was taking notes rapidly. Daniel spoke next, his tone even but edged with authority. And when a licensed physician on board attempted to intervene, she threatened him with a warning for interference. Patricia hesitated. "We will need to review the flight attendant's account as well." "You will," Daniel said, his eyes steady on hers. "But you will also review the passenger testimonies, the live stream footage, and the cabin surveillance recordings. I have already initiated a request to pull that data." Lucas looked up, slightly startled. That fast, Daniel's reply was simple. "That's my job." Evelyn's gaze moved from face to face, steady and unflinching. "I have lived long enough to know that if this isn't handled with care, it will be dismissed as a misunderstanding." It was not a misunderstanding. It was a choice, and it could have cost me my life. The room was quiet for a moment. Even the hum of the lights seemed louder. Patricia's pen tapped softly against her notepad. "Mrs. Carter, do you believe this was motivated by bias?" "Yes," Evelyn said without hesitation. "I have flown enough to know the difference between a security check and being singled out." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "We're not talking about a minor service issue. We are talking about a denial of medical assistance to a 70-year-old passenger in respiratory distress. That's not just a violation of company policy. It's a violation of FAA regulations." Patricia's expression shifted a subtle tightening around the eyes, the kind that came when the stakes became clearer. "Mr. Carter, as this involves a member of your family, there is a conflict of interest in your position." Daniel didn't flinch. "There's also a conflict of interest in allowing an employee to continue flying after this. That is why I relieved her on the spot." The security officer in the corner finally spoke. "We've confirmed Ms. Monroe has been removed from duty and placed on administrative leave pending investigation. She was escorted from the secure area without incident." Evelyn felt the faintest release of tension in her shoulders, but her voice remained steady. "That's a start. But you'll need to look deeper than one person. The culture that allowed this is still flying." Patricia's pen stopped tapping. She glanced at Lucas, then back to Evelyn. "What do you mean by culture?" Evelyn held her gaze, the silence, the way no one moved until my son called from the ground, the way passengers watched but said nothing, the way procedures were used as a shield to justify cruelty. That doesn't start and end with one uniform. Daniel's eyes softened for a moment as he looked at his mother. "She's right. If we treat this as an isolated case, nothing changes." Lucas cleared his throat. "We will need statements from the passengers who witnessed the exchange. Do you have any who are willing?" Sofia Martinez's voice came from the doorway. "I am." Heads turned as she stepped inside, phone still in hand. "I've been live streaming since before the incident started. 57,000 people have seen what happened tonight, and more will by morning." Patricia's expression shifted again. Not quite fear, but the alertness of someone calculating the cost of inaction. "Ms. Martinez, Your footage will be included in the review. We appreciate your cooperation." Sophia's smile was thin. "I'm not doing it for your appreciation." She looked at Evelyn. "I'm doing it because this is what my own grandmother went through her whole life, and no one listened. This time, people are listening." Daniel looked at Patricia and Lucas. "You now have multiple witnesses, video evidence, and a direct medical assessment from a licensed physician. This will not vanish into a drawer. It will go into policy." Patricia closed her folder slowly. "I understand." Daniel's tone remained calm, but there was steel beneath it. "No, Ms. Lane, you hear me? But I need you to understand that if this investigation is mishandled, we will escalate it beyond Aurora Skyways, FAA, civil rights advocacy groups, and the media that's already circling." Patricia gave the smallest nod. "Understood." Evelyn rose slowly from her chair. "Then, I think we're done for tonight." Daniel moved to her side, helping her gather her things. The security officer opened the door for them. As they stepped into the quiet corridor, Evelyn felt a different kind of stillness, the stillness that comes when the first wave of a fight has passed, and the next is forming on the horizon. Daniel walked with her toward the VIP transport area. "We'll get you to your hotel. Then I'll join the operations team. This isn't over." She looked up at him, her voice gentle. "I know. Just remember you're not fighting for me alone." He met her gaze, his own voice steady. "I never was." They reached the waiting car. As Daniel helped her inside, Evelyn caught Sophia's reflection in the glass doors behind them. The young woman gave her a small nod, not of farewell, but of solidarity. As the car pulled away, the terminal lights slid past in long streaks. Evelyn leaned back, inhaler resting in her lap, and thought about the strange mix of exhaustion and resolve filling her chest. She knew the days ahead would bring statements, reports, maybe even hearings. But for the first time since the incident began, she felt certain of one thing. The silence had been broken, and once it was broken, it could not be put back. The sun had barely risen when the phone on Daniel Carter's nightstand began to vibrate. He had only managed a few hours of sleep, the events of the night replaying in his head with stubborn clarity. He reached for the phone. Scanning the caller ID, it was Aurora Skyways' CEO, Marissa Dalton. "Daniel." Her voice came sharp and awake, as if she had been in meetings since dawn. "We need to talk. Now. Conference line in 5 minutes. Board members, legal, and communications are already on." Daniel sat up, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Understood. I'll join from my office." 20 minutes later, he was seated in the quiet, glass-walled space reserved for senior executives at the airline's Atlanta headquarters. The conference screen glowed with multiple video feeds, faces arranged in neat squares, most of them tense. Marissa sat at the head of the virtual table. "Before we begin," Marissa said, "Daniel, I want to acknowledge what happened on Flight 278. We've reviewed preliminary footage. I understand your mother was the passenger involved." Daniel's voice was calm. "That's correct. Then you should also understand," Marissa continued, "that this incident has gone viral. We have major outlets requesting statements, advocacy groups tagging us on social media, and Sophia Martinez's live stream has surpassed 100,000 views overnight." Daniel's eyes flicked to the screen where the head of communications, Peter Hensley, sat with his jaw tight. "It's not just a PR problem," Daniel said. "It's a systems problem. And if we treat it as optics, will fail before we start." One of the board members, an older man named Victor Shaw, leaned forward. "Daniel, with all respect, you have a personal stake here. Shouldn't you recuse yourself from the investigation?" Daniel didn't blink. "I have a professional obligation to fix the structure that allowed this to happen. Recusing myself would be the same as endorsing the status quo," Marissa interjected. "We're not here to debate involvement right now. We're here to determine next steps before this escalates further." Daniel's tone stayed steady. "Then, the first step is grounding the lead flight attendant involved until the investigation concludes. The second step is a public acknowledgement that the passenger's medical needs were ignored and that this violated both FAA safety regulations and company protocol." Victor frowned. "You want us to admit fault before the review is complete?" Daniel's gaze was level. "I want us to admit responsibility. The difference matters." On another feed, the head of legal, Diane Keller, spoke up. "From a liability standpoint, he's right. We're better served by transparency than by a defensive stance. The footage and passenger accounts are compelling. If we push back without acknowledging the obvious, we'll face greater reputational damage." Marissa's eyes narrowed slightly, calculating. "Then let's talk about systemic measures. What's your proposal?" Daniel took a breath. "A full audit of in-flight training, with emphasis on implicit bias, medical protocol compliance, and chain-of-command clarity. I also want a new rapid response channel for passengers experiencing medical or discriminatory issues, monitored in real time by operations staff, not just crew." Peter from communications leaned forward. "That's gonna be expensive." Daniel's reply was calm but firm. "It will be cheaper than a class action lawsuit or a federal intervention." The board was quiet for a beat. Evelyn's words from the night before echoed in his mind. "You're not fighting for me alone." Daniel spoke again, softer now but no less certain. "This is our chance to prove we mean what we print on the posters about safety, dignity, and respect. If we miss it, we become another example of corporate apologies that mean nothing." Marissa tapped her pen against the desk. "I want a draft of this plan by noon. And Daniel, you'll brief the media with me this afternoon." The meeting ended, screens going dark one by one until Daniel was alone with his reflection in the glass wall. He exhaled slowly, then picked up his phone and dialed. His mother answered on the second ring. "You sound like you've been in battle," Evelyn said. "In a way, I have," Daniel replied. "We're moving on this. You might be seeing my face on the news later." Evelyn's voice was warm but steady. "Do what you need to do. Just make sure the change lasts." Later that morning, Daniel walked into the media room. Lights were already set up, microphones angled toward the podium. Marissa stood beside him. The press clustered like a restless tide beyond the ropes. When the cameras went live, Marissa began. "Aurora Skyways deeply regrets the incident that occurred on Flight 278. A passenger's medical needs were not met in a timely or appropriate manner. We are committed to a thorough investigation and to implementing immediate reforms to ensure this never happens again." She turned slightly toward Daniel. "Our Senior Vice President of Flight Operations, Daniel Carter, will outline those measures." Daniel stepped to the podium. The lights were hot, but his voice was even. "This is not about one employee. This is about the systems that guide behavior on every flight. We will be conducting a full audit of our training and protocols, with new safeguards to address medical emergencies and discriminatory behavior in real time. We will also create a direct operations channel for passengers in crisis, monitored around the clock. Questions flew from the press. Mr. Carter, is it true the passenger involved is your mother? Yes, Daniel said plainly, and she experienced the same treatment too many others have endured in silence. The only difference is that this time there is evidence and a commitment to act. Another question came. What will happen to the crew member involved? She has been removed from duty pending the investigation. Daniel replied, the outcome will be determined by facts, not by spin. The press conference ended with the hum of camera shutters and the low buzz of conversations. Outside, the sky was a bright winter blue. Daniel knew the next days would be harder policy drafts, union negotiations, public scrutiny, but there was no turning back. That evening, Evelyn sat in her hotel room, watching her son on the news. She noticed the steadiness in his posture, the measured way he spoke, and the quiet conviction in his eyes. It was the same steadiness she had carried in her own battles decades earlier. She reached for her phone and sent him a single text. Proud of you. Keep going. The morning after the press conference, Evelyn Carter awoke to a quiet hotel room. For a moment, she simply lay still, listening to the faint hum of the heating unit, the muffled sounds of traffic far below. Her body felt heavy, but her mind was alert. She reached for the television remote and turned on the news. The incident on Flight 278 was everywhere. Every major network was looping the same clips the moment Daniel relieved the lead flight attendant of duty. His statements at the press conference, and stills of Evelyn in her seat with the inhaler in hand. A reporter's voice narrated over the footage. What began as a dispute over a passenger's medical device has become a national conversation about bias and accountability in the airline industry. Civil rights groups are already calling for federal oversight of airline training programs, citing the Carter incident as a turning point. Evelyn muted the television and let the images play silently. She felt a strange mix of vulnerability and purpose. Her face was now public, her experience dissected by strangers, but her story was also sparking something larger. Her phone buzzed with a message from Sophia Martinez. Mrs. Carter, are you seeing this? The video's at 2 million views. People are organizing petitions. There's even a rally planned at the airport today. Evelyn typed back, I see it. Thank you for standing up that night. Minutes later, the hotel phone rang. It was Daniel. Mom, there's something you need to know. The National Aviation Equity Alliance wants you to speak at a press event this afternoon. They think your voice will carry this beyond corporate promises. Evelyn sat up slowly. Daniel, I'm not a public speaker. You're the person who lived it, he said gently. And right now, people trust lived experience more than scripted words. She was quiet for a moment. If I do this, it's not about me. It's about everyone who's been treated like they don't belong at 30,000 feet. Exactly, Daniel said, and I'll be standing beside you. That afternoon, Evelyn arrived at the airport's atrium, where a podium had been set up near the giant glass windows overlooking the runways. A small crowd had gathered, holding signs that read, Fair skies for all, and passengers deserve dignity. Camera crews lined the back, and the low murmur of voices filled the space. When Evelyn stepped up to the microphone, the murmurs quieted. She took a slow breath and let her eyes move across the faces, young, old, travelers, employees in uniform, people who had seen themselves in her story. "My name is Evelyn Carter," she began, her voice clear but gentle. "2 nights ago, I boarded a plane expecting nothing more than to arrive safely at my destination. Instead, I was denied my own medical device when I needed it most. I was told no before anyone even checked what they were taking from me, and I was treated with suspicion I did not earn." She paused, letting the words settle. "This was not just about me. I have been flying for decades, and I know I'm not the first or the only person to face this. Too many people have been made to feel like strangers in a place they paid to be. Too many have been spoken to with a tone that says, 'You don't belong here.'" The crowd was still, leaning into her words. "I want to be clear, safety matters, procedures matter, but dignity matters too. And when a system uses its rules as a weapon instead of a safeguard, that system is broken. We cannot fix it by removing one person and leaving the rest untouched. We must look at the culture that made it possible." Behind her, Daniel stood with his hands folded, his gaze steady. He could see phones raised, recording every word. Evelyn's voice softened. "When I couldn't breathe on that flight, it wasn't just my lungs that hurt. It was the feeling that my humanity had been set aside for convenience. That is a feeling no passenger should carry. Not here, not anywhere." Applause rose in the atrium, not loud, but sustained, the kind that carried more weight than noise. After the event, reporters rushed forward, their questions rapid fire. Evelyn answered only a few before Daniel guided her away, shielding her from the press. In the car, she leaned back and closed her eyes. "You did well," Daniel said. "I told the truth," she replied simply. By evening, her speech was being shared across social media, spliced with footage from Sophia's live stream. Advocacy groups announced plans to push for federal hearings on airline conduct, and lawmakers began weighing in publicly. One senator tweeted, "Every passenger deserves safety and dignity. We will be looking closely at this industry's policies." Inside Aurora Skyway's headquarters, the mood was tense. Marissa Dalton called Daniel into her office. "We're getting calls from the Department of Transportation. They want to meet next week." Evelyn's speech has shifted the conversation from one incident to a national issue. Daniel nodded. "That's the point. We can either lead the change or be dragged into it." Marissa leaned back in her chair. "If we lead it, it means serious investment training, oversight, maybe even independent audits." Daniel met her gaze. "Then that's what we do. Anything less is just PR." Late that night, Evelyn sat by the hotel window, watching planes lift off into the dark sky. Each one carried hundreds of lives, each with their own stories, fears, and hopes. She thought about the faces she had seen in the atrium, strangers who understood without her having to explain. She whispered to herself, "Not for the cameras, not for anyone else. We can make it better." And in that quiet moment, she felt the weight of something rare, the sense that a single act, a single refusal to be silent, could ripple far beyond the place it began. 3 weeks later, Evelyn Carter found herself seated in a room she never imagined she would enter, a federal hearing chamber in Washington. D.C. Rows of microphones lined the long oak table, cameras from national networks perched like watchful eyes in the back. On the wall, behind the committee, sat the seal of the United States Senate. Daniel sat beside her, suit pressed, jaw steady. Across from them, members of the Senate Committee on Transportation leafed through briefing folders that contained the details of Flight 278. The chairwoman, Senator Grace Whitfield, adjusted her glasses, and spoke into the microphone. Mrs. Carter, thank you for being here today. We are here to address systemic failures in the airline industry's handling of passenger rights, medical emergencies, and bias in service. Your case has brought this issue into national focus. Evelyn leaned forward slightly. Senator, I appreciate the opportunity. I did not come here to relive humiliation. I came here to help make sure what happened to me cannot happen to anyone else. Her voice was calm, but the weight behind each word was unmistakable. Daniel followed, outlining the procedural gaps he had witnessed firsthand, the lack of real-time oversight, the inadequate medical training refreshers, and the absence of accountability channels for passengers when crew members crossed the line. He presented Aurora Skyway's newly implemented reforms, bias training, mandated by independent agencies, a live operations passenger support channel, and transparent reporting of in-flight incidents. Some senators nodded, others took notes. One asked if these measures could be industry-wide. Daniel replied without hesitation, "They should be. Dignity should not depend on which airline you happen to board." When the hearing ended, reporters swarmed the hallway. Evelyn answered only one question. "Do you think this will change things?" She paused, eyes steady. Change is not one moment. It's what you build after the moment ends. Over the next month, the Department of Transportation announced a partnership with civil rights organizations to develop national training and oversight standards for airline crews. The media called it the Carter Initiative. Advocacy groups praised it as a rare case where corporate reform and federal action worked in tandem. Meanwhile, Aurora Skyways began hosting open forums for passengers to share their experiences directly with leadership. At the first session, Evelyn attended quietly at the back, listening as travelers spoke of moments when they had been dismissed, ignored, or targeted. She saw the same patterns in their stories that she had lived, and she saw Daniel listening, really listening, to each one. One evening, she and Daniel walked together through the now quiet airport terminal after such a forum. The polished floors reflected the warm overhead lights, and the faint sound of a late-night boarding announcement echoed in the distance. "You did well today," Evelyn said. Daniel smiled faintly. "I had a good teacher." They stopped by a large window where a plane was taxiing toward the runway. Evelyn watched it move, the wingtips catching the glow of the floodlights. Do you ever think about how many people are in there, each with their own story, their own fragile little piece of life they're trying to carry safely to the next place all the time? Daniel said, "That's why we can't let this go." A month later, Evelyn was invited to speak at a national conference on passenger rights. She declined the keynote offer, but agreed to join a panel discussion. When asked why she chose to share the stage instead of standing alone, she smiled and said, "Because change is shared work. One voice can open a door. Many voices can keep it open." Her humility did not lessen her impact. The conference ended with a resolution to create a permanent passenger advocacy council, with Evelyn named as its honorary chair. In quieter moments, she returned to her own routines, morning walks, cooking in her small kitchen, reading in the sunlit corner of her living room. The media attention faded to a manageable hum, but letters continued to arrive from strangers thanking her for speaking out. Many shared their own experiences, some on planes, others in entirely different settings where they'd been made to feel small or invisible. One letter in particular stayed on her desk. It was from a young woman who wrote, I saw your story and decided to challenge the way my company treats customers in wheelchairs. I don't know if I'll win, but I know I have to try. You made me believe it's possible." Evelyn kept that letter under a small glass paperweight. On difficult days, she read it again. On the 1-year anniversary of Flight 278, Daniel invited her to join him on a short, ceremonial flight to mark the launch of the Carter Initiative across all domestic routes. Evelyn hesitated at first, the memories of that night still sharp, but finally agreed. As they boarded, crew members greeted her warmly. One, a young black woman named Tasha, smiled and said quietly, "We all know who you are. You've made our jobs better, too." Evelyn settled into her seat and looked out at the tarmac. For the first time in a long time, she felt no undercurrent of dread in the cabin air. When the plane leveled at cruising altitude, Daniel leaned over. "How's it feel?" Evelyn smiled softly, like breathing easy again. Hours later, after the landing and the quiet applause from passengers, Evelyn stepped back into the terminal. The air smelled faintly of coffee and jet fuel. She walked beside her son, the rhythm of her cane tapping lightly on the tile. At the exit, she stopped, looking back once at the gate. In her mind, she saw not the night she had been denied dignity, but the countless flights ahead where someone else would be treated with care instead of suspicion. "That's enough for me," she whispered. And with that, she stepped forward into the concourse, the sound of rolling suitcases blending into the hum of a place that, slowly, was learning to change. Evelyn Carter never set out to be a symbol. She only wanted to breathe, to be treated with the same respect every passenger deserves. Yet her story traveled far beyond the aisles of Flight 278. It reached conference halls, newsrooms, and the floor of the United States Senate. Through her quiet strength and Daniel's unshakable resolve, change took root. New policies now protect countless passengers from the humiliation she endured. Crew members receive real training, not just in safety, but in humanity. But we cannot forget why this change was necessary in the first place. Because discrimination, whether subtle or blatant, leaves a mark. Because silence, when faced with injustice, allows harm to grow. Evelyn's journey reminds us that dignity isn't given, it's defended. That one calm voice can echo across an entire system, and that each of us, in our own seat, on our own journey, may one day be called to speak up. If this story moved you, let it move you to action. Share it, talk about it, stand against the quiet moments of bias that happen every day, and before you go, like, share, and subscribe so you're here for the next story that matters.